To answer that question, yes. It's not really about the craziness of the world that we're going to address, or a world that won't sit still. I hope that doesn't mislead the topic because it's not really. I know that today's world is crazy and that's kind of what we all want answers to, but that's not exactly the conversation tonight. The focus is more about the materialism of the world, and how we remain true to who we are, in spite of the different circumstances of the world that we find ourselves in. Both the timing of our lives, in other words, the time of where society is, where the world is, where everything is, but more importantly, place, where we are, our surroundings, our environment, our communities, our families, and how much of an impact that has on us in relation to who we are, as a person, and who our identity is, and what we are. Um, the purpose of studying this tonight, is to understand that there's something deeper within each of us that is meant to withstand all the external circumstances that exist. And the reason why that's so important is because as a human being, we are kind of built to be impacted and influenced by our external circumstances. We are naturally prone to kind of follow the pack, or kind of, if something, an idea makes sense, or we don't always want to stand out, and we sort of follow the herd, and um whatever is, we don't want to make too much noise or cause too much trouble, or whatever it is at the time. I'm talking about the most of us. um so does that mean that's who we become, or is there something deeper to us? And that's really the gist of the conversation tonight, and how it applied to Yosef, and what Yosef wanted for us, his descendants, even if we may not be from the tribe of Yosef, but spiritually, what he was trying to pass on to the generations. So there's a very this whole Torah portion is fascinating with lots of content, specifically the reunification of Yosef and his brothers. When he reveals himself to them, Yehuda is about to go to war with all of Egypt if they don't allow Binyamin to be free, and that's when Yosef reveals himself, and then they have this emotional reunion, and Yaakov comes down, and reunites with his son after 22 years. It's just, there's a lot of content here, and Yaakov meets Paro. But in the process of all this, there's a verse, and that's what we have here on the screen, that's a lot lesser known. And this is where, before the brothers go back to tell their father that his son Yosef is still alive, because remember, after they sold him into slavery, they lied, and they lied to their father, and they said that he was killed, or they found his bloody coat. Um, so what did Yosef give them? He gave them all provisions, as well as he gave them clothing. He gave them money and he gave them clothing, right? However, he gave Binyamin, his brother from not just his father, but his brother from his mother as well, from Rachel. He gave him 5 extra pairs of clothing, or 5 changes of clothing. So let's just read this in Hebrew. That Yosef gave them provisions. In other words, he gave everyone the kulam nasan ish chalifais smalais. He gave them many, several clothing. Ulu Binyamin, but to Binyamin, Nasan, he gave, I'm reading it in the Hebrew because I want you to see the contrast. He gave 300 pieces of gold and 5 pieces of clothing. In other words, the Torah specifies the number of pieces of clothing he gave to Binyamin. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us anything by accident. The Torah doesn't tell us anything just for no reason. There's always a deeper lesson. There's always a meaning for it, and we're going to unpack that right here. So first of all, like this, the obvious question is, we all know the story, but just to recap, the reason why, at least from a face value, why this whole problem began, the jealousy of the brothers of Yosef, is because Yaakov loved Rachel. Rachel was the woman he wanted to marry, and Yosef was the firstborn from Rachel. So Yaakov treated Yosef with extra attention, and made made him a coat. The Torah tells us he made him a special coat, and the brothers were jealous of Yosef, which is what led to the rivalry or whatever you want to call it, which eventually led them selling him into slavery into Egypt. Now, there's a lot of deeper commentary and information on what actually was going on spiritually and everything else, but from a very from a point of face value and simple understanding, this was a case of favoritism from Yaakov to Yosef, which led to the brothers being jealous of their brother Yosef receiving extra attention from their father. So the obvious question here is, why is Yosef making that same mistake? In fact, to give a little bit of background, one of the reasons why Yosef didn't reveal himself to his brothers right away when they came for food and for provisions during the hunger, is he told them they need to bring their brother Binyamin in order to prove that they're serious. This is before he revealed himself to them. And they didn't want to because Yaakov didn't let. Yaakov didn't want to lose Binyamin. He was the only remaining son from his wife Rachel. And Yosef said, I'm not giving you anything until you bring Binyamin. So they had to bring Binyamin. And then he planted this silver goblet in Binyamin's bag and found it and said that Binyamin is going to be kept here as a slave. And he wanted to see if they're going to risk their life for Binyamin, who was Rachel's son, to see if they changed their ways from selling him into slavery, and if they were going to protect Binyamin, unlike they treated Yosef when they sold him into slavery. And they passed the test, and they were willing to go to war with Egypt in order to protect Binyamin. So now that that is all over with and they're reunited, why is Yosef doing something that might lead to the same level of jealousy, showing that there's a special bond between Yosef and Binyamin versus all the other brothers? Why is he giving him extra? And the commentaries ask this very question. The Talmud even asks this question. Take a look. He gave them all to each one several changes of clothing, and to Binyamin he gave 5 changes of clothing. So the Talmud asks very simply, is it possible that the very thing from which the righteous man Yosef suffered himself, that he will stumble and make the same mistake for his father's show of favoritism towards him arouse the enmity of his brothers, or the jealousy of his brothers? So why would he make that same mistake? As Rashi clarifies in the Talmud there. So, an obvious question. So the Talmud gives an answer that doesn't really answer the question, which also tells us, by the way, there's always something deeper going on in these stories. It's never even though there always has to be the human element because the Torah has to make sense to us on a face value, but there's always something deeper on a spiritual level that's beyond our comprehension. But here's what the Talmud answers. That what was happening is that Yosef was by giving him here. Let's just read it. Binyamin Bar Yafa says that he intimated to Binyamin that his descendant, who was Binyamin's descendant, is going to be Mordechai in the Purim story. That his descendant would go out from the presence of the king wearing 5 royal garments, as it stated, and Mordechai went forth from the presence of the king in the royal apparel of sky blue and white, with a great crown of gold and with a wrap of fine linen and purple, which equals 5 garments. So Yosef was trying to preempt that blessing of Mordechai being victorious over Haman in the Purim story, that just like Mordechai in the Purim story is going to leave the king victorious with 5 garments, Yosef was preempting that Binyamin should leave the king Yosef with the 5 garments, and sort of trying to preempt that kind of miracle to happen in the Purim story. And that's how the Talmud ends. The Talmud doesn't, go on to explain. But really, like, that doesn't really like you're going to risk alienating your brothers, or arousing their jealousy just to prove a prophecy. Just tell them the prophecy or whatever. Why does it have to be done in such a cryptic and risky way, we might add? Now, there's another area here we see that clothing is mentioned when it comes to Yosef. Let's actually go back to that screen here, where it talks about that Yosef and clothing seem to be mentioned in the Torah more than once to be a coincidence. Number one is when he got the coat from his father. It says his father made him a colorful coat, which was made from different colors of wool. Then the Torah tells us then the Torah, when he was released from prison, the Torah says that they changed his clothes, which is obvious, but the Torah tells us they changed his clothes to be worthy of standing in front of Pharaoh to interpret his dreams. in the beginning of last week's parsha. And then over here it says that Yosef gave clothing to all the brothers, as well as the extra pair of 5 clothing to Binyamin. And here's the source of that. The Pharaoh called Yosef, and they rushed him from the dungeon, and he shaved, and they changed his clothes, and he came to Pharaoh. All right, so what is the deal of clothing? And what's going on over here? What's with Yosef and clothing? What's really the message of here? So to understand this, let's take a look. Actually, I don't know if we have the text right here, but I'm going to go back to the screen here. Let's dive in for a few minutes into the difference between Yosef and his brothers. So first of all, when the brothers showed up at Yosef's palace to ask for food, so remember, it's been what, 22 years? So it says that Yosef recognized them, and they didn't recognize Yosef. And what does Rashi tell us? Or yeah, what does Rashi tell us? But quoting from the commentaries, is that Yosef grew a beard. And when he was 17 years old, when they sold him into slavery, he didn't have a beard. But 22 years later, he had a beard, so he was unrecognizable. But the brothers already had beards, so they were recognizable. That's basically the simple explanation. But as we mentioned earlier, that everything has a deeper explanation or deeper understanding in the Torah. There's always layers of commentary. And there's something deeper about the recognition of each other. Because I don't know if I was trying to look this up before the class, but scientifically, back then, like, was it really that hard to recognize your brother, even if he grew a beard? I don't know, I couldn't find any good answers to this. But the idea that just because he grew a beard means that you don't recognize, it wasn't just like they were seeing him in a marketplace far away. I mean, they were talking to him. They were in his presence for an extended period amount of time. Like, shouldn't there have been some resemblance that would ensure that there is a recognition or some sort of like, is that really enough that he grew a beard that he disguised himself? So there is a commentary that says that Yosef took extra precautions to make himself unrecognizable. That he basically, put his hat lower and he disguised his face a little bit and he did certain things to make sure his brothers don't recognize him. But there was also a spiritual thing. It was a
input
spiritual
something?
thing. Yes?
Hello?
Hello?
Oh, can I input into that statement?
Yeah, sure.
Could it also be that, Yosef was a dignitary and he was all adorned with, regal clothes and stuff like that. And the brothers that would be something that the brothers would never even think that it would have been their brother sitting there because he was dressed so differently too.
100%. And that's kind of the logical understanding. That's really what the Torah is kind of referring to, because they weren't expecting the brother they sold into slavery is going to be a viceroy to the king. So yeah, absolutely. But there still is a spiritual layer. And the spiritual layer here is that the brothers, to them, the idea of being spiritual and the idea of being holy and a member of Yaakov's house meant that you cannot engage in materialism and be spiritual at the same time. In other words, you cannot be a king or, decked out in royalty or wearing a crown or whatever else, is included in being a viceroy of Egypt, or in general, you can't be part of the world. You can't be part of the physical world at the same time as being a spiritual, holy person. Holiness and materialism don't go together in the brothers' minds. In other words, and that's why it says they were shepherds. When they were asked what their profession is, they're shepherds. What does it mean being a shepherd? Is that you don't necessarily your engagement with the world is limited because you don't know how to interact with the world. Your engagement with the world, you only know how to shepherd. In other words, you only know how to work with a certain species that is limited, that only requires a limited level of engagement to some extent. And I know there are many other explanations about a shepherd and leaders and all the other things, but in this case, it means that your ability to engage with the materialism in the world and retain your holiness are limited. So therefore, a shepherd is the best way to ensure and retain your connection with God.
Can
And
I can
to
I
serve,
interject?
I'm sorry?
Can I interject a little bit?
Yeah, but give me 1 second. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen because I'm having trouble with my sound, and it's hard for me
Okay.
to hear. My speaker is not complying, so everything is very hard to hear. Give me 1 second. All right, let me reshare my screen. All right, go ahead.
So I think I don't know where I read this or heard it from before that the shepherds had a bad smell from being with the sheep all the time, and that made them another reason not to be mixing in with the Egyptians.
There's many explanations of the shepherds. The shepherd has a lot of 100%. You're not wrong. But what I'm trying to say is that the idea of being a shepherd in this case means that you're separated from the human element of society.
Oh, okay.
In other words, the idea of being Moshe was a shepherd, and God used that as an example of you could shepherd my people. And there's many great explanations of the idea of being a shepherd. But for this conversation specifically, we're using the shepherd as being distant from the human interaction in the world,
Oh, okay.
specifically the human interaction.
Oh, okay.
So the brothers felt, or at least the brothers were on a level that you're either or. Either you're going to be spiritual and distant and separate from the physical world, which means you have to uh, not be physically adorned. You cannot dress like a king. You cannot eat like a king if you want to be spiritual. You cannot sleep like a king. I'm sorry? You can't live in a palace if you want to be spiritual. It doesn't go together. So they could not recognize Yosef. When it says they didn't recognize Yosef is they could not recognize the possibility. Once again, this is another layer of understanding. It's not denying the fact that they didn't recognize him physically, but it's another layer of they didn't recognize that you could be a king in a palace, wearing a crown, eating like a king, having servants or whatever else, whatever a king would live like in those days, and at the same time be a holy person. They could not reconcile the two. To them, that was impossible. You couldn't dress in beautiful clothing and be a godly person. That didn't go together. And the previous Rebbe explains it over here. Let's take a look. Here's what's going on. Our forefathers and the tribes were shepherds and didn't involve themselves in any worldly matters. That's why I said for this conversation, we're focused on that aspect. Joseph, on the other hand, wasn't a shepherd. When he was living with his father, he stayed close to him and didn't go out to the pastures with his brothers. Later, when he went down to Egypt, he got involved in all sorts of major responsibilities and affairs. The point is this. Our forefathers are described as a vehicle. Even while they were down here in the physical bodies, they were totally devoted to God. They lived lives of holiness, completely removed from the distractions of the physical world. Everything they did was done with complete oneness and attachment to God without even a moment of disconnect. The idea of being a vehicle, the word vehicle is a translation of a wagon. And just like a wagon is attached to the horses, and wherever the horses go, that's where the wagon goes. The wagon doesn't have to decide it's following the horses. It's attached. So the behavior of the patriarchs was in a way of being attached to God, that wherever God wants them to go or to be, they were going that way. So everything they did was done with complete oneness and attachment to God, without even a moment of disconnect. The tribes too were deeply unified with God. In other words, the brothers. Because of that, they chose to be shepherds. They wanted to stay away from anything that might distract them or interfere with their connection to God. That's why they would go out into the fields and the wilderness, so nothing would get in the way of their focus and attachment to holiness. So to them, they could not be involved with other humans or other societies because it would distract their connection and their spiritual engagement. So the fact that Yosef was a viceroy in Egypt and the superpower of the world and then busy saving the world, to them, that was like impossible to do at the same time while you were trying to be a holy person. So Yosef certainly wasn't a shepherd. He was involved in all kinds of responsibilities, even when he was in Potiphar's house. All the work, both inside and out in the field, was on him. Later, when he was in prison, he had plenty of duties there too. And when he became king over Egypt, his workload only grew as he took charge of running the entire country and dealing with major affairs. So even as a prisoner, he was still engaged with other human beings. In other words, when the two ministers were imprisoned, the first people they're talking to is Yosef. Yosef was in charge of all the other prisoners. So even as a prisoner, he was at the grip or at the center of human society. So he was the opposite of separating himself from society. So to the brothers, you can't live a Yosef life and be connected to God because it's too many distractions. There's too many possibilities of going astray. There's too many human tendencies or desires or other things that might get in the way. There's egos and everything else. You can't be godly and interact with the world. So they could not understand Yosef's behavior. But Yosef was able to achieve that. The truth is that Yosef was also a vehicle. The word is markava. He was also attached to God for godliness. And not only that, but his level of connection, I'm using the word connection instead of vehicle, was actually higher than the brothers. Meaning, even while he was fully involved in everything that he was doing, he still remained completely united and attached to God, even though he was so engaged, even though he was wearing a king palace suit and sorry, whatever, the royal robes, and he was in a palace and he was eating like a king and he was doing everything that a king does. He was still connected to God on the same level of his brothers and even higher. And his brothers couldn't understand that. To them, that didn't make any sense. Does someone have a question? Does someone have a question? I'm going to mute everyone if that's okay. Sorry about that. All right. So, and this is the text I was looking for before. So this is why it says that Yosef recognized his brothers because his brothers were basically, they were all spiritual, and Yosef, and they didn't recognize him. And when they said, where do you come from? We come from Canaan because we're not engaged with the world. Okay. As far as speaking to them harshly. So there's a commentary that says that harshly he was trying to wake them up from this idea that they have to be living as hermits to be spiritual. Like, stop separating yourself from the world. You're meant to live in God's world and work with the world and influence the world and elevate the world versus trying to separate yourself from it or avoid the distractions. You're meant to, make your society better. So the Ramban actually, Marvin, this is to your point. The Ramban actually talks about how he disguised himself. As soon as Yosef saw them, he recognized them, and he got scared that they might recognize him too. So he disguised himself. He put on a turban on his forehead, covering part of his face, and changed his appearance.
Gotcha.
All right. But now the point here we want to talk about is the difference in approach between living within the world and living within and living separate from the world. So I know in Judaism, and we talk about this a lot through many of our classes, the emphasis and the focus is always that we have to live within the world and we have to influence our surroundings. We have to not run away from them. Everything we come in contact with in materialism is an opportunity to elevate it. And that's why the more materialism, the better, because it's an opportunity versus a distraction and so on and so forth. However, we all know as humans that there is value in the disconnect. All right. How often do you see an ad for, take a break, disconnect from everything and find serenity in like this, in this place, because you'll be totally cut off from all the distractions and all the craziness of the world, right? So and you see that and you feel good, like I would love to be out of out of all the noise and out of all the craziness. Like the idea of not having to deal with these distractions of the world is quite appealing. Not only that, from a spiritual point of view, if you truly do want to grow spiritually, there is some merit to the idea that you're going to insulate yourself just a little bit, or at least for a temporary amount of time, to try and work on yourself and not have to do that within in a society or in a situation where you have that many distractions. And that goes for anything you're trying to work on, whether it's meditating, whether it's anything. So how do how do you balance the two here? So I'm going to skip this text. And by the way, this text actually, Marvin, goes to your point a lot, but I think we kind of covered it already. So I want to talk about how Yosef is able to still have that same serenity, even though he has all the distractions. So this is the truth. Yosef had a lot of help. Here's why this was the case for Yosef to be able to accomplish what he accomplished. Due to his lofty soul, worldly affairs did not distract Yosef at all. Not only did they not interfere with his connection to God, but even while he was deeply involved in all those responsibilities, he remained a vehicle, a markava. He remained a wagon. A wagon is the right translation. A wagon which is attached to God, completely devoted and united. And this is the general rule. If someone feels connected to the world, meaning the world matters to them, in other words, the materialism of the world matters to them, and the opinions matter to them, and the level of their status matters to them, and they get all caught up into it, then it's a distraction. And once they're all caught in it, the world's demands naturally start to distract and overwhelm them. But if someone has no real attachment to the world because it simply doesn't hold any weight for them, then they won't get pulled in. The world doesn't have a grip on them, so it can't distract them. Due to the lofty nature of his soul, Yosef simply didn't give the world any kind of importance. So the world never had a hold on him, and it couldn't throw him off his connection to Hashem. I added those words, but that's what it's trying to say. Now, what is the outcome of having such a high soul? The idea is that the inner core always remains the same. That the essence of the person is always the same. But the outer garments change depending on the person's level. They can rise or fall. But the essence of a person is the same. So what was Yosef trying to do with the clothing is he was trying to show his brothers that you could wear different clothing. Is that you don't have to be a shepherd to stay connected to God. You could come to Egypt. Come live in Egypt. And what are you going to do when you come to Egypt? You're going to live in Goshen. And you're going to create a community. And you're going to live like God wants you to live. And you're going to influence those around you in a positive way. And you're going to be a positive influence in society versus being influenced negatively. Because as long as the core of you is true, then the clothing that you wear doesn't matter. In other words, the external appearance or the external side of you doesn't have any influence because it's just material. As long as the spiritual part of you is what's dominating and it's the essence of who you are, then nothing else could get in the way. Nothing else could change who you are. Nothing could influence you negatively. And this is why he gave them clothing in general. It doesn't explain about Binyamin yet. We're getting there. So Yosef showed his brothers how this works, how someone can wear all sorts of outer garments and still remain true inside. He demonstrated it himself. Even though they didn't recognize him because of how he looked and acted on the outside, he was still standing strong in his righteousness. So in general, Yosef was trying to teach them that he is still the same essence of who he is, and his clothing is just who he's required to be in order to save the world. But it wasn't trying to say that you become a different person by putting on this clothing, or that if you have to wear this clothing for this thing or that. In other words, your clothing are an external part of you. They're not your essence. Your essence never changes. And as long as your essence is in charge and your essence is dominating, then your clothing are just a tool, and a tool that you're elevating. And this is why the clothing are mentioned in Yosef's case so many times, because the clothing meant nothing to him. And it showed that no matter how many times his clothing changed, he still remained the same Yosef, the same person who was connected to God on the same mission. Now, we just saw in the text of the previous Rebbe that Yosef had a very lofty soul. So great for Yosef. He had a lofty soul. What about the rest of us? We don't have Yosef's soul. And what was he trying to do when he gave Binyamin those extra 5 garments? So let's take a look. The path Yosef took to reach this level is hinted at the verse, he shaved and changed his clothes. This shows that Yosef's essence, who he really was, never descended or became absorbed into the mindset of Egypt. That's why right at the beginning he changed his clothes. It was a clear signal. This thing of this world didn't hold any real place in his life. They couldn't distract or shake him from his deep humility and attachment to God. All the royal responsibilities, his role as a viceroy, his involvement in government were just external garments. They didn't alter his inner self in any way. Now, what was he trying to tell Binyamin? Why did he give Binyamin extra clothing? So let's go to this. And why does the Gemara answer the story with a story of Mordechai? So let's fast forward to the story of Mordechai, just for a minute. When the Jews were expelled to Babylonia, and then eventually it was conquered by Persia, and that's when the Purim story happened. So it says that Mordechai would hang out at the king's palace. Well, because Esther was there, but also he engaged in the affairs of the government, and he was the head of the Sanhedrin. Now, one thing the Megillah doesn't tell us, and one thing that is more in the commentaries, is that his fellow sages of the Sanhedrin disagreed with his approach, because the Sanhedrin. Now, listen, just to catch you up, the Sanhedrin is the body of 70 sages that were the leaders of the Jewish community, and they were the leaders of Jewish law, and they were the ones who had to be knowledgeable in everything. They had to know every single language. They had to know every single custom and every single tradition of every single society. And they, of course, had to know the entire Torah inside out, and their character had to be flawless. We don't have anyone today, even remotely, who would be eligible to serve on the Sanhedrin, and they all had to receive their rabbinical ordination going back to Moshe, which was almost impossible to get. It was very difficult, meaning like the people that were on the Sanhedrin were of the highest caliber. Now, because they saw their responsibility to maintain the spiritual life of the Jewish people, they disagreed with Mordechai's approach in engaging in materialistic matters of dealing with the government. That's not our job. We're in exile now. Our job is to make sure we're maintaining the spiritual life of the Jewish people in exile. And they disagree with Mordechai being a sitting in the king's gates or whatever he was doing. Now, obviously, eventually they agreed with him after, when the whole Purim story when the whole decree became apparent and everything else. But their initial opposition, it wasn't invalid. In other words, they were concerned that Mordechai wasn't investing his effort in the spiritual needs of the Jewish people, and he was focused his needs on the political needs of the Jewish people. But really what Mordechai was doing is he was demonstrating that within the royalty of the palace, he was showing that the value of the Jewish soul and the value of the Jewish identity can never be influenced negatively. In fact, there's a Hasidic discourse that tells us that when it says that Esther went into the palace disguised when she was chosen as the queen, and she had to hide her identity, it's actually compared to the soul having to come from the part of God and having to descend into this world and into a physical body, because that's what God wants it to do, but it has to basically condense itself and limit itself to be in a physical body and basically be in prison in this physical world. And that was comparable to Esther having to conceal her identity in order to be the queen of Achashverosh. And that's the comparison in Kabbalah. And what Mordechai was demonstrating is that soul is so powerful that it could retain its identity, and not just retain its identity, but shine and save the entire Jewish people while being in the palace. And this is what Yosef was proving with Binyamin, that for all the rest of the brothers, they needed this reminder in general, that wherever you go, that you're about to come to exile now. You're about to come down to Egypt. This is what God wants. This is what Hashem told Abraham, that your children are going to go down to Egypt and eventually they're going to be enslaved. And that's not just going to be this exile, but there's going to be other exiles. And since Yosef is considered to be the one that sustains the Jewish people throughout exile, not just in Egypt, but all the exiles, So Yosef was preparing the Jewish people for how to survive, that you're going to have different clothing, meaning you're going to be in different situations. You're going to have different circumstances. You're going to have different places, different times. You're going to have different types of everything. And you need to know that no matter what kind of clothing you're wearing, no matter what circumstance you find yourself in, no matter what time you find yourself in, you are still the same Yosef. You are still the same person. And nobody can take that away from you. And to Binyamin, he's stressing it even more so. Because to Binyamin, you need an extra reminder that even when your own fellow Jews, your own fellow spiritual Jews, I'm not talking about bad people, good people, rabbis, sages are telling you, don't engage in materialism, it's too dangerous. Remember that if that's what you're called upon to do, you're still going to have my blessing. Yosef is saying that you're going to have the blessing of our soul, of the soul that we have from God, and it's going to survive. And that was the blessing to Mordechai. And that was the blessing to all of us. That we all have that piece of Yosef inside of us, that even though we don't have Yosef's soul, but the idea of Yosef opening the door and then giving us that energy and that possibility, telling us that whatever pair of clothing we're wearing and whatever situation we find ourselves in, we have to remember that we're still Yosef and that nobody could take that identity away from us and nobody could change who we are. And we have to remember that, and we have to live that, and we have to make sure that no matter what clothing they put on us, in other words, even if it's by choice, we still are our soul, just like Yosef did in Egypt. That's how we survived the exile. And this is what Yosef was trying to prepare them for. This is the idea behind changing of the clothes. All of it was part of preparing the way to go down to Egypt, and it was Yosef who paved that path to help them understand that you're going to go undercover now. You're going to be a spy. You're going to be God's spy, because you're going to retain your soul. You're going to retain your essence of who you are, but you are going to be wearing different clothing. You're not going to be in your spiritual Mecca anymore. You're not going to be shepherds in the field and praying all day and whatever, insular communities you thought you were going to be in. That's not happening anymore. Now you're coming into the real world. You're going to have different clothes, but you're still going to be Yosef. And this is part of the reason why by divine providence, Yosef was sent into slavery by his brothers to become the viceroy of Egypt, is to show them that it is possible to live in the world, in society, in all situations, from being a slave in Potiphar's house to being imprisoned and to being a viceroy in Egypt, which, by the way, represents all the ups and downs of the Jewish people in exile, from being tormented and being in prison to being a viceroy, that you could still survive and retain your identity as a Jew and retain your essence and retain your soul. And the clothing are just the external circumstances, but they're going to mean nothing. They're not going to change who you are. You are going to be who you are because of your soul. And what is your mission? Is to elevate everything that you have and all the materialism that you have and bring it to holiness. And that's why it says that when they left Egypt, they took as much as they could with them, because every piece of materialism was elevating it to holiness and utilizing it for holy things. And that's why they had a mission to, during the plague of darkness, to go and to see what everyone has, what their slave masters had, and they would have to ask them before they left to say, could you please give me these gifts, because they were going to use those things for holy stuff, or they were meant to use them for holy stuff. So now, this is the lesson that we need to take from this. A person's life moves through shifting times and changing seasons. When you are in one place and moment, when you who you are in one place and moment isn't the same who you are at somewhere else, in a different time or circumstance. And yet, despite all this, a person is expected to carry themselves through all these changes with a steady inner sense of direction that doesn't bend to the constantly changing environment. That is the deeper meaning of changing garments. A garment isn't part of your essence. It's something external, like the outer changes and fluctuations that surround a person's life. This is the human story. No matter how much the surroundings shift, whether in time, place, or circumstance, they are just garments. What matters is that person conducts themselves with strength and consistency, guarding their inner core so that it doesn't waver as everything around them changes. And if we can hold on to that and remember that we have that soul and we have the strength from Yosef to retain that soul, retain that identity, retain who we are, and not change it, even with all the different, all the different circumstances that are changing, then we can overcome whatever craziness is happening in the world. And we can overcome whatever noise is in the world because we're able to withstand the challenges that we might face. I want to just read a part of this text. I'm sorry. These two lines right over here in the middle. We're all Yosefs today. We all have a part of Yosef within us. And the only way we can be successful in holding on to our values, the morals and religious convictions we hold dear, is by mastering the ability to change clothes. In other words, change your clothes, but don't change who you are. Is that no matter what the circumstance might be, you still are the essence of who you are, and that never changes. So Yosef's garments represented his secret navigating life's changes. He was a prisoner, he was a viceroy, he was a slave, whatever he was, but his essence was always the same. And this is what he gifted to us to be able to apply throughout exile and throughout all the challenges that he was facing in his life. And this is what he gave to us, the Jewish people, to withstand our own exile and our own circumstances, that we have the essence of our soul with us that is able to withstand and to able to overcome the changing winds that always apply in the world that we live in until the coming of Mashiach, to never forget who we are and to retain our identity. Let's hope that we won't have to put up with that anymore with Mashiach's arrival very soon, and we should be able to celebrate who we are, celebrate our ancestors, and celebrate the Yosefs throughout our history who've maintained their identity and maintained their pride, as well as those who didn't, but to be able to all celebrate together with the coming of Mashiach. Good Shabbos, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.